Look up at the quiet, endless expanse of the night sky. Beyond the heavy, comforting blanket of the dark, the stars flicker like distant, ancient eyes, watching over the silent deserts of the earth. For thousands of years, humanity has sat around crackling fires, whispering stories of those who descended from those very heavens. The towering figures who stepped out of the sky and onto the sun-baked, cracking clay of ancient Mesopotamia. But as the cool desert winds slowly erase the deep footprints they left behind, a lingering, hushed question remains buried beneath the golden dunes. We have always been told the grand tales of how they arrived. But why are there no stories of their return to the stars? What if they never left? Tonight, we are going to journey back through the thick mists of time, returning to the cradle of civilization. We are not here to study cold stones or complicated histories. Instead, we are here to feel the quiet, sinking realization of beings who slowly understood they were stranded. What if this beautiful, breathing world of deep oceans and heavy soil was not just a brief resting place in the vast cosmos? What if, instead, the earth became a velvet cage, a soft, invisible prison that gently, yet firmly, refused to let them go? Before we let the shifting, whispering sands of time carry us away into this forgotten mystery, take a very slow, deep breath. Let the heavy weight of your day sink down into the earth beneath you, releasing all your tension into the dark. If you find comfort and peace in these ancient, midnight whispers, please gently tap the like button and subscribe to our journey. Now just let your body completely relax, close your eyes, and let the cool, ancient winds of Sumer wash over you as we drift safely into the long, silent night. Picture, if you will, an endless ocean of golden sand stretching out beneath a pale, ancient sun. Long before the first great cities of Sumer were ever dreamed of, long before the first brick was baked in the heat of the day, there was only the vast, breathing quiet of the desert. The landscape of early Mesopotamia was a world of profound stillness, interrupted only by the low, haunting whistle of the wind as it carved gentle waves into the endless dunes. In this quiet, untouched world, imagine the sudden, heavy presence of something entirely foreign. They did not crash with the fiery violence we often see in modern stories. Instead, imagine them descending with a slow, deliberate grace, coming to rest upon the soft, yielding earth. These were the vessels of the gods, the great sky chariots of the Anunnaki. But do not picture complex panels of buttons, flashing lights, or the tangled wires of human engineering. To the ancient eye, and to ours tonight, they were simply mountains of perfect, flawless metal. They were smooth, gleaming shapes that caught the harsh light of the sun and reflected it back with blinding intensity. They were unblemished, cold, and entirely alien to the warm, textured world of dirt, stone, and water. For a short time, perhaps, they stood there as towering monuments to the stars from which they came. They were completely silent, resting heavily upon the cracked clay and shifting sands. But the earth, as we all know, is a deeply patient living thing. The earth does not fight with sudden violence. It wins through the slow, undeniable passage of time. And so the quiet battle began. It started with something as small and insignificant as a single grain of sand. Listen closely to the wind in your mind. The desert wind is never truly empty. It carries millions of microscopic pieces of quartz, broken shells, and ancient dust. When the wind blew across the vast plains, it picked up these tiny, rough fragments of the earth and swept them against the perfect mirrored hulls of the great vessels. At first, it was just a soft whisper. Shh, shh. The sound of a few grains brushing against the cold, unyielding metal. But the wind never stops. Day after day, night after endless night, the earth threw its tiny, gritty fingers against the foreign objects. Over decades, those soft whispers became a relentless, invisible sandpaper. Slowly, the blinding reflection of the metal began to dull. The flawless, mirror-like finish that had once perfectly reflected the stars became scratched, scuffed, and clouded. The vessels were losing their celestial shine. They were beginning to look tired. Then came the dampness. Even in the arid cradle of civilization, the nights bring a sudden, sharp drop in temperature, pulling moisture from the cooling air. Every morning, before the sun rose to bake the land, a heavy, cold dew would settle over the giant metal shapes. This water was not pure. It carried the minerals, the salts, and the deep chemical breath of the planet. When the water touched the scratched, exposed skin of the star metal, a silent, invisible reaction began. You do not need to understand the complex chemistry of oxidation to feel what was happening. Simply imagine the earth reaching out and tasting the metal, claiming it, absorbing it slowly into its own body. Small, jagged, blooming patches of orange and red began to appear on the dulling silver. It looked almost as if the great machines were bruising, or perhaps bleeding a strange, crusty blood. This was the rust. It did not happen overnight. It was a creeping slumber that spread inch by inch across the colossal structures. The smooth, cold surfaces that had once effortlessly glided through the frictionless vacuum of deep space were now flaking away, turning soft and brittle. If you were to walk up to one of these sleeping giants and place your hand against its side, you would no longer feel the smooth chill of starlight. Instead, your palm would press against a rough, blistering texture. Your fingers would come away stained with a fine, dark red powder, the beautiful, sad dust of decay. The metal was forgetting how to be strong. It was learning how to be fragile. It was learning how to be part of the earth. As the centuries rolled on, the heavy weight of gravity and the shifting sands continued their quiet work. The desert is not static. It is a slow-moving sea. Giant dunes, pushed by the seasonal winds, began to creep towards the resting vessels. Very softly, the sand began to pile up against the bases of the great machines. Imagine the feeling of sinking, not into water, but into a warm, dry bed of heavy blankets. First, the lowest parts of the vessels disappeared beneath the golden grains. The places where they touched the ground were swallowed up, anchoring them firmly in place. Then, the sand drifted higher, creeping up the beautifully curved sides, blocking the grand entryways, and filling every hollow crevice. The weight of this accumulated earth was immense. Thousands of tons of sand pressing inward, holding the vessels in a tight, unyielding embrace. The machines were no longer sitting on top of the world. They were being pulled deep into its heavy, dark center. And then, there was the heat. The Mesopotamian sun is famously brutal. During the long, blinding days, the exposed, rusting metal would absorb the intense heat, expanding ever so slightly, baking in the relentless glare. The heat made the metal soft, made the rust flake away faster, dropping into the sand like dry, dead leaves falling from an ancient tree. But when the sun dipped below the horizon, the desert plunged into a deep, freezing cold. As the temperature plummeted, the giant metal structures would contract. In the absolute dead of the night, if you were standing nearby, you would hear it. a deep, echoing groan ringing out across the empty miles, a metallic creak that sounded almost like a heavy, mournful sigh. It was the sound of the metal warping, the sound of structural spines cracking under the shifting temperatures. It was the haunting lullaby of machines that knew they would never fly again. They could not repair themselves. The beings who arrived in them watched in quiet despair as their only way home dissolved before their eyes. There was no grand explosion, no tragic destruction in battle. There was only the slow, quiet, inevitable surrender to the elements. The earth did not violently destroy their ships. It softly hugged them to death. Eventually there was no metal left to see. The wind and the sand had finished their slow, majestic work. The giant dunes rolled completely over the top of the highest spires. If a wanderer were to walk across that landscape thousands of years later, under a bright starry sky, they would not see the remnants of a highly advanced cosmic civilization. They would only see a slightly unusual, gentle hill in the desert. They might sit upon that hill to rest, feeling the warmth of the sand beneath them, completely unaware that they were resting directly on top of a rusted, sleeping giant. The ships did not break. They simply dissolved into the landscape, returning to the very minerals and dust from which the universe is made. The sky had come down to the earth, and the earth, with its quiet, infinite patience, had swallowed it whole, and just like that, the first invisible bars of the velvet cage were locked into place. The physical means to leave were gone, buried deep beneath the whispering, shifting sands, leaving the travelers with nothing but the heavy, grounding pull of their new, eternal home. Now that the grand, silver vessels were slowly crumbling into dust beneath the golden dunes, another invisible force was quietly going to work on the travelers themselves. To understand why they could never return to the stars, we must forget about broken engines or lost maps. Instead, we need to focus on something much more intimate, something you are doing at this very moment without even thinking about it. Take another slow, deep breath in. Feel the air entering your lungs. To you, it feels completely natural, light, and easy. But to a being who has lived among the thin, sterile silence of the stars, the air on our planet is not empty space. It is a thick, heavy soup. It is an ocean of invisible, swirling elements. When the Anunnaki first stepped out onto the sun-baked clay of Mesopotamia, their very first breath must have felt like inhaling water. The atmosphere of the Earth is incredibly dense, packed tightly with oxygen, nitrogen, and a heavy, lingering humidity. Imagine leaving a perfectly clean, climate-controlled room where the air is thin and pure, and suddenly stepping into a dense, overgrown greenhouse in the middle of a hot summer afternoon. The air here had a taste. It had a weight. With every inhale, they were drawing in the heavy moisture evaporated from the rushing waters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They were breathing in the microscopic dust of the desert, the rich, dark smell of wet soil after a sudden rain, and the sweet, heavy pollen of thousands of ancient, blooming reeds. For the first few centuries, simply breathing was a labor. Their chests had to heave to pull in this thick, rich atmosphere. Their lungs had to work twice as hard to process the overwhelming cocktail of earthly scents and heavy gases. Slowly, with every labored breath, the atmosphere was filling them from the inside out. The air of the earth was settling into their chests, anchoring them from within. But the thick air was only the first invisible layer of their velvet cage. Beneath their feet, a much stronger, much more ancient force was waiting to claim them. We call it gravity. But let us not think of gravity as a cold, scientific law. Let us imagine it as a physical sensation, as the jealous, invisible embrace of the planet itself. Earth is a dense, rocky world with a heavy iron heart. Because of this, it pulls everything toward its center with a relentless, unyielding grip. We do not feel this grip because we were born into it. Our bones and muscles were perfectly designed by nature to push back against this constant downward pull. We walk, we run, and we leap, completely unaware of the invisible hands holding us to the ground. But for those who came from elsewhere, gravity was a crushing burden. Imagine taking a thick, heavy wool blanket that has been soaked in water and draping it completely over your shoulders. Now, imagine wearing that heavy, wet blanket every single minute of every single day for thousands of years. That is what the gravity of the earth felt like. When they tried to walk across the muddy banks of the rivers, their legs felt like they were made of solid lead. Every step required a conscious, exhausting effort. The simple act of lifting a foot and placing it forward was a battle against the invisible hands that wanted to pull them down into the soil. When they stood tall to look out over the vast horizons, the weight of the world pulled constantly at their spines, urging them to bow, urging them to kneel, urging them to rest in the dirt. Over the slow, sweeping passage of deep time, you cannot fight the earth. If you stay long enough, you must surrender to it, and your body must change to survive. And so their bodies began to change. To carry the immense, crushing weight of their own bodies, their internal architecture had to adapt, slowly, over countless generations of cells rebuilding themselves in this new environment. Their bones grew thicker. They became denser, heavier, packing themselves with the minerals of the earth just to withstand the daily pressure of simply standing up. Their hearts, too, had to transform. To push their blood through limbs that were constantly being dragged downward, their hearts had to beat with a deeper, more forceful rhythm. The delicate, graceful biology that had allowed them to travel through the weightless, floating silence of the cosmos was being replaced. They were slowly being forged into creatures of stone and heavy muscle. They were becoming earthbound. They did not realize that by adapting to survive on the earth, they were systematically destroying their ability to ever leave it. Think about what it takes to leave this planet. To break free from the invisible hands of gravity, you need a violent, terrifying amount of energy. You need to push backward against the earth with enough explosive fury to tear a hole through the thick, heavy ocean of the atmosphere. Now imagine these beings. Their shining ships of star metal were gone, rusted and buried under the shifting dunes. And even if they still had those ships, the beings themselves were no longer the light, ethereal travelers who had first arrived. They were heavy. Their bones were thick with the earth's minerals. Their lungs were entirely dependent on the thick, wet air of the Mesopotamian marshes. If they were to somehow launch themselves back into the cold, thin vacuum of space, their new, heavy bodies would likely fail them. The earth had changed them too deeply. It had woven itself into their biology, into their blood, and into their bones. There was no sudden, dramatic realization of defeat. There was no single moment of despair. It was simply a slow, creeping understanding that arrived over thousands of years, as quiet as the setting sun. They would look down at their hands that had once guided ships through the stars, and see hands that were now thick, heavy, and stained with the clay of the earth. They would look up at the night sky, at the distant, flickering stars from which they came, and feel the immense, undeniable weight pulling them down into the dirt. The earth had not built walls to keep them here. It did not need bars or chains. It had simply offered them its thick, sweet air to breathe, and wrapped them tightly in its jealous, invisible gravity. It had made them too heavy to fly. The earth had gently pulled them out of the sky, changed them into creatures of the soil, and whispered that they were finally, entirely, and forever home. As the heavy golden sun finally dips below the flat horizon of the Mesopotamian plains, the oppressive heat of the day slowly begins to release its grip on the earth. The sky above you gently transitions. It fades from a blinding, hazy bronze into a deep, soothing purple, and finally it settles into a vast, bottomless ocean of velvet black. This is the time when the noisy, chaotic world of the daylight softens. The blazing sun that binds everyone to the soil is gone, and in its place, the infinite expanse of the cosmos reveals itself. Millions of stars pierce through the darkness, glittering like scattered diamonds on a cloth of dark silk. To the ancient humans, this was a time of rest. But to those who had fallen from those very stars, the night was a time of profound, aching memory. Imagine standing at the base of a massive, artificial mountain made of baked mud and clay. This is the ziggurat. To the humans who dragged the heavy bricks to build it, it is a grand temple, a monument to the gods. But to the gods themselves, to the stranded Anunnaki, it was something much more desperate. It was a ladder. It was a physical, exhausting attempt to reach just a few hundred feet closer to a home they could no longer touch. Feel the rough, dry texture of the clay bricks beneath your hands. Even in the cool of the night, the stone holds a faint, lingering warmth from the afternoon sun. It is a comforting, earthly warmth. But as the towering figures begin their slow, heavy climb up the steep, narrow steps, that warmth is left behind. With their bodies now dense and heavy from the unrelenting gravity of the earth, every step upward is a monumental effort. You can hear the slow, rhythmic sound of their footsteps. Thud. Pause. Thud. The soft scraping of their woven sandals against the stone. You can hear their deep, labored breathing as they force their heavy lungs to pull in the thick night air. They are pushing against the very planet that has claimed them, fighting the invisible hands of gravity just to stand a little higher. Finally, they reach the summit. Up here, elevated above the sleeping world, the atmosphere shifts. The air is thinner, cooler. The heavy scents of the damp riverbanks and the smoking hearth fires of the human settlements below are blown away. The wind at the top of the ziggurat is different from the wind on the ground. It does not rustle through the reeds or sweep up the desert sand. It is a lonely, roaming wind that whistles sharply around the sharp corners of the stone sanctuary. It sounds like a long, drawn-out sigh echoing through an empty canyon. From this high vantage point, the stranded travelers look down for a moment. Below them, the earth is covered in a soft, impenetrable blanket of shadows. The winding rivers look like ribbons of dark glass. The small, scattered fires of the human villages flicker weakly, like a handful of dying embers trying to mimic the stars. The earth below is asleep, bound by its own heavy rhythms. But the travelers do not look down for long. Slowly, they tilt their heads upward. Imagine their eyes, ancient and tired, scanning the overwhelming canvas of the night sky. They are not looking at the constellations with the innocent wonder of human astrologers. They are looking for a specific coordinate. They are searching the vast, indifferent dark for a single, faint point of light. A pale, distant star that holds the fading memory of a world without heavy gravity. A world of effortless movement and crystalline skies. In the days before their great ships rusted into the sand, distance meant nothing. Space was an ocean they knew how to sail. But now, without the humming engines of their vessels, the space between the Earth and that tiny flickering star is an impassable, terrifying gulf. How do you call out across the universe when your machines have turned to dust? You do not use flashing lights or loud, booming voices. You use the quietest, deepest part of yourself. Imagine standing perfectly still on that stone peak. The wind whips fiercely at your garments, but your body is rigid, anchored to the stone. You close your eyes. You gather every ounce of your focus, every fragment of your fading cosmic energy, and you push it outward, up into the freezing void. It is like casting a single invisible thread made of pure thought into an ocean that has no bottom. For a moment, there is a desperate, beautiful hope. You imagine that invisible thread flying past the heavy clouds, breaking through the atmosphere, and soaring silently past the freezing, dead moons and the giant, swirling planets. You imagine it crossing the unimaginably cold, dark spaces between the solar systems, racing toward that one specific, distant home. And then, you wait. You stand on the high stone altar, your eyes closed, your breathing slowed to a barely perceptible rhythm. And you listen. You are not listening with your ears. You are listening with your mind, waiting for a tug on that invisible thread. Waiting for a whisper, a signal, a faint echo of recognition from the stars to say, "We hear you. We are coming." This is the longest night of the soul. Minute after minute, hour after heavy hour, the stillness stretches on. The silence of the universe is not just the absence of noise. It is a heavy, crushing presence. It is a silence so absolute, so vast, that it makes you feel entirely insignificant. The wind continues to howl mournfully around the mud-brick pillars of the ziggurat. Whoosh, the sound of the earth reminding them exactly where they are. As the night deepens, the chilling, heartbreaking truth slowly settles over them like a layer of frost. The invisible thread has snapped. Or perhaps it never truly reached beyond the heavy blanket of the earth's sky. The signal is lost in the infinite dark. The universe is simply too wide, too old, and too indifferent to carry a whisper across the galaxy without the power of their lost machines. No one is listening. No one is coming. The profound sense of isolation that washes over them is not sharp or violent. It does not make them scream into the wind or tear at their garments. It is a slow, sinking resignation. It is the quiet feeling of watching a door slowly swing shut and hearing the heavy lock click into place, knowing you do not have the key. They open their eyes. The stars are still there, incredibly beautiful, cold, and utterly out of reach. The twinkling lights that once looked like a map of endless possibilities now look like the bars of a majestic, unattainable ceiling. They are no longer sailors looking at an ocean. They are prisoners looking through a high, barred window. Slowly, the tension leaves their broad, heavy shoulders. The physical toll of standing rigid in the cold wind catches up to their earthbound bodies. Their knees ache from the gravity. Their lungs feel heavy. The desperate hope that had pulled them up the hundreds of steep steps drains away, leaving only a hollow, echoing acceptance. They lower their heads. They turn their backs to the magnificent, silent cosmos. With slow, heavy, defeated steps, they begin the long descent back down into the shadows of the sleeping world. They walk back down into the thick, humid air, back down into the scents of the mud and the reeds, back down to the human fires. They carry the crushing silence of the stars down with them, folding it deep into their hearts. The connection is completely, irrevocably severed. The stars are no longer their home. The stars are now just a beautiful, haunting memory, shining down on an earth that has quietly, firmly swallowed them whole. There is a very simple, undeniable truth about any living thing in this universe. To survive, you must consume the world around you. You must take pieces of your environment, draw them inside of yourself, and let them become a part of who you are. When the great silver vessels of the Anunnaki first descended from the silent stars, they brought with them the pure, untainted nourishment of their home world. For a time, they lived untouched by the earth. They were visitors, enclosed in their own perfect, isolated biology. But no supply lasts forever. As the decades turned into centuries, and the cold metal of their ships slowly surrendered to the rust and the sand, their pantries of starlight emptied. They were left with a profound, terrifying hunger and a deep, parching thirst. They had no choice but to turn to the wild, breathing landscape of ancient Mesopotamia to keep themselves alive. Imagine standing on the muddy banks of the mighty Tigris River just as the sun begins to rise, casting a soft, golden glow over the rippling water. The river is not crystal clear, like a sterile, artificial spring. It is a living, moving force. It runs thick with the dark, rich silt of the mountains. It carries the crushed leaves of ancient forests, the minerals of deep underground caves, and the very essence of the earth itself. Imagine one of these tall, ethereal beings kneeling at the edge of the water. Their reflection ripples in the muddy current. Slowly, they reach out, cupping their elegant hands, and dip them into the cold, rushing stream. They lift the heavy water to their lips and take their very first earthly drink. Feel the sensation of that cool liquid sliding down a dry throat. This was not the empty, purified water of deep space. This water had a flavor. It tasted of wet stone, of green reeds, and of heavy, iron-rich clay. As they swallowed, the water of the earth branched out inside of their chests like a sprawling river delta. It flowed into their alien veins, mixing with their blood, slowly diluting the essence of the stars with the heavy, muddy reality of the planet. Water is the great builder of life. It makes up the vast majority of our bodies. Over the years, as they drank from the winding rivers of the valley every single day, the moisture of the earth completely replaced the cosmic fluids they had arrived with. Without even realizing it, they were drinking the planet. They were letting the earth flow directly into their hearts. But water alone cannot sustain a towering physical form. The heavy gravity of their new home demanded strong muscles and thick bones, and those things require solid, grounding sustenance. Listen to the gentle rustling of the wind passing through a field of tall, golden grass. Long before the sprawling cities of humanity, the wild valleys of Mesopotamia were blanketed in fields of ancient wheat. Einkorn and emmer, the grandfathers of all the bread we eat today. Imagine the travelers walking through these wild fields, running their long fingers over the rough, bearded husks of the grain. They had to learn the slow, patient rhythms of the harvest. They gathered the golden stalks under the blazing sun, feeling the rough chaff scratching against their skin. Now picture the heavy, rhythmic sound of a grinding stone. Scrape, crush, scrape. To turn the hard seeds into food, they had to press them between heavy blocks of volcanic rock. The air around them would fill with a fine, sweet-smelling dust as the grain was violently crushed into a coarse, heavy flour. This was the smell of survival. When they mixed this flour with the river water and baked it over open, crackling fires, the scent that drifted into the night air was entirely new to them. It was the warm, comforting, heavy smell of baked bread. Imagine breaking open that first sun-baked loaf. It is not soft and light. It is dense, heavy, and steaming in the cool evening air. The crust is rough, baked hard by the fire, holding the dark ash of the burnt wood. As they took a bite, they had to chew with effort. The ancient bread was coarse, carrying the deep, nutty flavor of the soil, the faint smokiness of the fire, and the gritty, tiny fragments of the grinding stone itself. It was heavy in the stomach. It made them feel full, warm, and deeply tired. The food of the earth does not make you want to fly. It makes you want to lie down in the soft grass and rest. Every time they sat by the fire and consumed the heavy bread of the valley, every time they chewed the roots and the fruits that grew from the dark soil, a miraculous and silent transformation was taking place deep inside their bodies. Biology is a slow, endless cycle of rebuilding. Old cells die, and new cells are born to take their place. But the body can only build new cells using the materials you give it. For these ancient travelers, the materials of their home world were completely gone. As the centuries stretched into millennia, their bodies began to rebuild themselves using exclusively the building blocks of the earth. The iron in the soil became the iron in their blood, turning it thicker, warmer, and a deeper shade of red. The calcium from the river water seeped into their bones, making them heavier, denser, and inextricably bound to the gravity of the planet. The complex proteins of the ancient wheat became their muscles, their skin, and the very structure of their eyes. They were undergoing a slow, beautiful assimilation. They were being digested by the environment, not to be destroyed, but to be absorbed and remade. If you were to look at them after 5,000 years, they might still look like gods on the outside, but on the inside, they were fundamentally different. There was nothing left of the stars within them. They were entirely constructed from the dirt, the water, and the wind of Mesopotamia. They had become a biological extension of the landscape. Listen closely to the gentle, rhythmic thudding inside your own chest. Your heartbeat is the drum of your life. Before they arrived, the heartbeat of the Anunnaki might have been a fast, light flutter, designed for the weightless, effortless environment of space. But as they ate the heavy food and drank the muddy water, their pulse began to change. It slowed down. It grew deeper, louder, and more powerful. Thump, thump, thump. Their new earthly hearts had to beat with a profound strength to push their thick, iron-rich blood through their heavy limbs. But more beautifully, their heartbeat began to synchronize with the rhythms of the earth itself. They began to feel the heavy pull of the moon in their veins. They began to feel the changing of the seasons, not just as a shift in the weather, but as a deep, biological tide within their own bodies. When winter came, their blood slowed, urging them to hibernate. When the spring floods rushed through the valley, their hearts raced with the rising waters. They could not leave the earth because the earth was no longer just a place beneath their feet. It was inside of them. It was them. If they had somehow found a way to build a new ship, and if they had somehow managed to pierce through the thick atmosphere and return to the cold, weightless vacuum of space, their bodies would have violently rejected the journey. They were no longer creatures of the cosmos. Their heavy bones would have ached for the pressure of gravity. Their lungs would have suffocated without the thick, humid scent of the rivers. Their digestive systems, now perfectly adapted to the coarse, rich grains of the soil, would have withered away on the sterile rations of the stars. The velvet cage was perfectly complete. The earth had not captured them with force. It had simply invited them to dinner. It had fed them its warm bread and offered them its cool waters, and in return, it had quietly claimed their biology. The majestic beings of the sky had eaten the fruit of the planet, and by doing so, they had traded their wings for roots, planting themselves firmly and forever into the deep, dark soil of human history. Let us leave the surface of the world behind for a little while. Let us drift away from the rustling fields of wild wheat, the flowing rivers, and the endless oceans of golden sand. To truly understand how the door to the stars was finally, permanently locked, we must sink deep down into the very belly of the earth. Imagine floating down through the soil, past the roots of the ancient trees, past the layers of damp clay and soft limestone. As we go deeper, the warmth of the sun fades away completely. The air grows incredibly cool, still and heavy with the scent of raw minerals and wet stone. Here, in the absolute crushing darkness beneath the crust of the world, there is no day and no night. There is only the eternal, unchanging weight of the planet pressing inward from every side. For a long time, the only sound down here was the slow, silent dripping of water seeping through cracks in the rock. But then, a new rhythm began. Listen closely in the dark. At first, it is very faint, a rhythmic, echoing clack, pause, clack. It is the harsh, unforgiving sound of metal striking solid stone. It echoes down long, jagged tunnels, bouncing off the damp walls and vibrating deep within your chest. If you follow that sound, drifting softly through the winding, narrow caverns, a faint, flickering light eventually pierces the gloom. It is the low, orange glow of smoky torches, casting long, wavering shadows across the rough walls of a massive underground quarry. In this dim, suffocating light, you see them. The Igigi. In the ancient stories of Sumer, the Igigi were the lesser gods. They were the ones who carried the burden. While the great lords of the sky walked on the surface and built the first monumental cities, the Igigi were sent down into the suffocating dark to dig. They were the laborers, the miners, the silent hands working in the shadows. But why were they digging? They were not looking for simple building stones. They were tearing open the veins of the earth, searching for the raw, glowing lifeblood of their dying ships. They needed the precious metals, the rare crystals, the incredibly dense elements that could be burned, crushed, or refined to create the magnificent energy required to pierce the sky. They were trying to mine the fuel for their journey home. But the earth does not give up its treasures easily. Imagine the sheer, exhausting physical reality of their existence. You are swinging a heavy, blunt tool against a wall of solid granite. Your hands, once elegant and soft, are now covered in thick, hardened calluses and deep blisters. Every time the metal strikes the rock, a violent shockwave travels up your arms, settling deep into your shoulders and your spine. Strike, breathe, strike. The air down in the deep mines is incredibly stale. There is no fresh wind to cool your skin. The atmosphere is choked with a thick, choking cloud of pulverized rock dust. With every heavy breath, the Igigi inhaled the very stone they were trying to break. The dust settled on their skin, turning them the color of ash. It mixed with their heavy, pouring sweat, turning into a thick, gray mud that coated their bodies and weighed down their limbs. For hundreds, perhaps thousands of years, this was their entire universe. They did not see the stars they were trying to return to. They only saw the few inches of rough rock illuminated by the dying light of a torch. They lived in a world of endless repetition, endless vibration, and profound, crushing fatigue. Think about the feeling of being truly, deeply exhausted. Not the tiredness you feel at the end of a long day, but an exhaustion that sinks into the very marrow of your bones. A weariness that spans generations. Your muscles burn, your joints ache, and your mind becomes a numb, empty space, focused only on the next swing, and the next, and the next. They were digging to fuel the great vessels on the surface, but the earth was quietly draining their own fuel in return. There comes a breaking point for all living things. The spirit can only be pushed against the stone for so long before it simply refuses to move. The ancient texts call it a rebellion, a great mutiny of the gods. But do not picture a violent, bloody uprising. Do not picture shouting armies or chaotic battles. Down in the heavy, crushing dark, there was no energy left for shouting. The rebellion of the Igigi was much simpler, much quieter, and infinitely more powerful. Imagine a single, unremarkable moment in the endless dark. One miner, his back bent, his arms trembling from the weight of his tool, raises his hands for another strike. But halfway through the motion, he stops. He looks at the unyielding wall of stone in front of him. He looks at his bruised, bleeding hands. And then, he simply opens his fingers. The heavy metal tool falls from his grasp. It hits the stone floor with a sharp, echoing clang that rings out through the cavern. The worker beside him pauses. He turns his head, his face obscured by a mask of gray dust, and looks at the dropped tool. A moment of profound understanding passes between them, a silent realization that they cannot dig their way to the stars. The earth is too vast, the rock is too hard, and the sky is too far away. Slowly, the second worker lowers his arms. He opens his fingers. Another tool falls to the ground. Clang. Like a gentle ripple spreading across a still pond, the surrender moves through the massive, winding network of tunnels. You hear it echoing from the deepest shafts to the upper galleries. Clang, clang, clang. Hundreds, then thousands of heavy tools hitting the floor. Within minutes, the relentless, echoing rhythm that had defined the underworld for centuries simply fades away. The deep, heavy breathing of the exhausted workers slows down. They sink to their knees in the dust, leaning their backs against the cool, damp rock. They close their eyes. And then there is the silence. It is a thick, terrifying and beautiful silence. It fills the caverns like a sudden flood of dark water. Without the rhythmic striking of the stone, the underworld returns to the quiet, eternal slumber it had enjoyed before the travelers arrived. The earth has absorbed their labor, broken their will, and gently forced them to rest. This deep, heavy silence down in the dark spelled the final doom for the magnificent machines resting up on the surface. When the Igigi stopped digging, the veins of the earth were closed. The flow of precious, shimmering energy from the deep underground to the surface altars completely ceased. There would be no more fuel. There would be no spark to ignite the rusted engines. The great supply chain of the gods was broken, not by war, but by simple, overwhelming exhaustion. Imagine the realization slowly creeping up to the surface. The leaders, the grand architects of the sky, waiting by their tarnished vessels, watching the entrances of the mines. But no carts of glowing ore emerge. No exhausted workers climb out of the dark, carrying the lifeblood of the stars. There is only the wind howling across the empty desert. The umbilical cord between the deep earth and the high heavens had been cut. Without the raw energy pulled from the dirt, The vessels were truly, finally, dead. They were no longer resting ships. They were hollow tombs of metal, entirely starved of the light they needed to wake up. The machines had lost their voice, and now they had lost their food. The rebellion of the Igigi was not just an end to the mining. It was the quiet, undeniable acceptance of their fate. By dropping their tools in the dark, they were casting the final vote. They were silently declaring that the struggle was over. They would no longer fight the gravity, the rock, or the mud. They would stay, feel the relief of that surrender. Sometimes, giving up a heavy burden is the most peaceful feeling in the world. As the Igigi sat in the dark, listening to the silence of the earth, the tension slowly drained from their aching muscles. They did not have to swing the pickaxe anymore. They did not have to look at the sky and ache for a home they could not reach. The heavy, unyielding earth had won. It had starved the great machines by breaking the backs of the laborers, pulling them into a quiet, dusty sleep deep beneath the surface. And as the torches slowly burned out one by one, plunging the ancient mines back into absolute darkness, the earth locked its invisible velvet cage tighter, keeping its new children safely buried in its cold, rocky embrace. Let us slowly rise from the heavy, suffocating darkness of the underground mines. Let us drift back up through the layers of cool, damp stone, past the twisting roots of the ancient trees, and emerge once again onto the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia. Take a very slow, incredibly deep breath of the open air. After the crushing silence of the caves, the surface of the world feels open and boundless. You look up, and the sky stretches out above you in a massive, uninterrupted dome of brilliant, pale blue. To the innocent human eye, the sky represents the ultimate freedom. It looks empty. It looks like an open door to the universe, simply waiting to be walked through. But to the stranded travelers, the great architects who had fallen from the stars, the sky was the most terrifying illusion of all. Because they knew the truth about that beautiful expanse of blue. They knew that it was not empty space, it was an ocean, and it was hanging completely upside down, right above their heads. To understand the final, impenetrable wall of their velvet cage, we have to change the way we think about the air. We walk through it every day without feeling it, brushing it aside with our hands as if it were nothing. But the atmosphere of our planet is a massive, incredibly dense physical object. It is a thick, heavy blanket of swirling gases, holding millions of tons of evaporated water, crushing down on the surface of the world with an unimaginable weight. Imagine standing at the very bottom of a deep, dark trench in the sea. If you tried to swim straight up to the surface, you would feel the immense, crushing pressure of the water pushing back against you. The atmosphere of the earth is exactly the same. The Anunnaki were not standing on the edge of space. They were trapped at the very bottom of a deep, churning atmospheric ocean. Now, picture one of their rusted, deeply exhausted vessels, buried halfway in the golden sand. Even if the Igigi had not dropped their tools in the dark, even if they had somehow managed to carry up a few glowing shards of energy to spark the engines back to life, the journey upward would have been a nightmare. To leave the earth, a ship cannot simply float away. It has to violently tear a hole through the sky. Imagine the sheer, agonizing effort of a heavy metal giant trying to push its way up through that upside-down ocean. As soon as the vessel lifted off the ground, the thick air would immediately push back. The friction of the dense gases scraping against the hull would be terrifying. In the cold, empty vacuum of deep space, there is no resistance. A ship can glide in absolute, peaceful silence forever. But here, within the heavy blanket of the earth, movement creates heat. If they tried to force their way upward, the friction of the thick air would cause the surrounding atmosphere to catch fire. The sky would literally burn around them, acting as a fiery wall, trying to melt them back down into the dirt. But the friction was only the quietest part of the sky's defense. The Earth is a living, breathing, incredibly volatile planet, and its atmosphere is always moving. Imagine the slow, heavy buildup of a Mesopotamian afternoon. The heat of the sun beats relentlessly on the damp soil, drawing millions of gallons of invisible water vapor high into the air. The sky above begins to change. The peaceful, innocent blue is slowly swallowed by towering, bruised mountains of dark gray clouds. These are the thunderheads. They are not just mist. They are colossal, swirling engines of raw, planetary power, stretching miles up into the sky, guarding the exit to the stars. Listen to the low, warning rumble vibrating through the ground. Rumble, crack. The storms of the ancient world were terrifying displays of energy, as the hot, heavy air clashed with the freezing layers of the upper atmosphere. The sky would tear itself apart. Imagine a rusted, weakened ship trying to navigate through that chaos. It would be like a small, fragile wooden boat trying to row against a massive, churning hurricane. The winds up inside those dark clouds do not just blow gently, they scream. They are violent, unpredictable currents of air that can rip metal apart. They would catch the broad sides of a struggling ship, tossing it back and forth, completely overpowering the dying engines. And then there is the lightning. We watch lightning from the safety of our homes, admiring the brief, jagged flashes of light. But up inside the belly of the storm, lightning is a blinding, deafening weapon of raw electricity. Imagine the earth firing massive bolts of pure, scorching energy into the sides of the fleeing vessels. The thunder would not just be a sound, it would be a physical, crushing blow, a shockwave that would rattle the very bones of the travelers inside. The Earth's weather was a chaotic, impossible minefield. The storms were the planet's natural wardens, patrolling the high borders of the atmosphere, making sure that anything trying to escape was beaten back down to the ground. But let us imagine, just for a fleeting moment, that a ship somehow managed to survive the crushing friction. Imagine it fought its way through the screaming winds and the blinding strikes of the thunderheads. Imagine it pushed higher, leaving the clouds behind, entering the upper edges of the sky. Even then, the Earth had one final cruel trick waiting for them. As you go higher and higher, the air finally begins to thin out. The thick, heavy soup of the surface fades away. For a moment, it might feel like freedom. It might feel like the edge of space is finally within reach. But without that thick air, there is nothing for the wings or the thrusters to push against. The ship, heavy with the iron and the clay of the earth, would suddenly find itself swimming in a void. The engines designed to push against the dense atmosphere would suddenly roar helplessly in the thinning air, finding no traction, finding no grip. And right there, at the very edge of the black, starry void, the invisible, jealous hand of the Earth's gravity would reach up and pull its fingers tight. The ship would stall. It would hang there, suspended for one heartbreaking, silent second between the beautiful, out-of-reach stars and the massive, heavy curve of the blue planet below. And then, the fall would begin. It would not be a graceful return. It would be a heavy, terrifying plummet. The Earth would drag them back down through the freezing thin air, back down through the violent, screaming storms, back down through the thick, wet heat of the lower sky, until they finally crashed back into the soft, unforgiving mud of the riverbanks. The travelers understood this. They did not need to attempt the journey to know how it would end. They could sit in the cool shade of the date palms, watch the majestic, terrifying thunderclouds roll across the horizon, and simply know. The sky was not a door, it was a ceiling. It was a ceiling made of wind, of fire, of crushing pressure, and of violent electrical storms. The earth had wrapped itself in an invisible armor that was soft to breathe, but impossible to break. The realization must have been a profoundly quiet one. When you realize that the cage you are in is not made of iron bars that can be cut, but made of the very air you need to breathe, the fight simply leaves you. You stop looking at the sky as a destination, and you start looking at it as a roof. The velvet cage was entirely secure. The ships were dead, the deep fuel was locked away, the gravity had claimed their bodies, and the roaring ocean of the sky stood firmly between them and the stars. They were truly, permanently marooned on the shores of humanity. They had nowhere left to go but deeper into the earth, and deeper into the stories of the humans who were quietly watching them fade away. As the great, heavy door to the stars was finally sealed shut by the thick atmosphere and the relentless gravity of the earth, a new chapter began to unfold upon the surface of the world. It was not a chapter written in the quiet, majestic language of the cosmos. Instead, it was written in the chaotic, vibrant, and overwhelmingly loud language of a brand new species. To understand why the ancient travelers eventually faded into the shadows, you must close your eyes and listen to the changing rhythm of the planet. In the very beginning, long before the great ships rusted into the sand, the earth was a place of profound, stretching silence. The only sounds were the deep, natural breaths of the world, the rushing of the great rivers, the howling of the desert wind, and the occasional lonely cry of a wild bird soaring high above the marshes. It was a peaceful, empty canvas. But then, humanity began to multiply. At first, the humans were just small, quiet shadows moving softly along the edges of the water. They were few in number, deeply respectful of the towering beings who had stepped from the sky. They lived in small, hushed clusters, whispering their prayers and keeping their fires low. But humanity carries a frantic, burning spark within its chest. Unlike the stranded travelers, who measured time in slow, agonizing millennia, humans have incredibly short, fragile lives. Because their time on the earth is so brief, they are driven by a desperate, beautiful urgency to live, to build, to grow, and to fill every empty space they can find. Slowly, the hushed whispers of the early river settlements grew into a steady, vibrating hum. Imagine standing in the center of one of the first great, sprawling cities of mud and brick. The sun has just gone down, but the earth does not go to sleep. Instead, the darkness is instantly pierced by the sharp, crackling sound of 1,000 burning hearths. Crackle, pop, hiss. The dry cedar wood and the bundles of dried reeds catch fire, throwing bright, frantic orange sparks into the cool night air. With the fire comes the smoke. It is not the clean, pure air of the high mountains or the thin, sterile atmosphere of deep space. It is a thick, stinging fog of wood smoke, roasting meat and baked clay. The heavy scent hangs low over the city, trapped by the humid air of the river valley. It burns the eyes and coats the back of the throat. And then, there is the noise. It is a chaotic, layered blanket of sound that never, ever stops. Listen to the high, piercing cries of newborn children greeting the world. Listen to the loud, echoing laughter of workers sharing coarse bread after a brutal day in the fields. There is the constant, rhythmic thudding of 100 stone mortars grinding grain into flour. Thud, scrape, thud. There is the chaotic bleating of thousands of domesticated sheep and goats, penned tightly together, moving like a restless, woolly sea. There is the barking of wild dogs drawn to the edge of the light. To the human ear, this is the sound of prosperity. This is the beautiful, comforting noise of a species surviving and conquering the dark. But to the Anunnaki, it was absolute sensory agony. Remember that these beings had evolved in the absolute, freezing quiet of the vast cosmos. Their minds were built to process the slow, silent rotations of planets and the distant, humming energy of the stars. Even after their bodies grew heavy and their bones thickened with the minerals of the earth, their minds still craved the profound, empty peace of the void. Imagine being deeply, profoundly exhausted. Your body aches from the heavy gravity. Your heart is heavy with the knowledge that you can never go home. And all you want to do is close your eyes and rest in the dark. But you cannot sleep, because the room you are in is filled with 1,000 frantic, shouting children who never stop moving, never stop building, and never stop demanding your attention. The humans worshipped them, yes. They built massive temples, the towering ziggurats, to house their gods. But even this worship was painfully loud. Imagine sitting on a massive, heavy throne of carved stone inside the dark sanctuary of the temple. You are trying to find a moment of peace, trying to listen for the faint, impossible echo of your lost home. But outside the thick, mud-brick walls, a massive crowd is gathering. They are banging heavy drums that vibrate through the floorboards and travel up through your dense, aching bones. Boom. 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 They are chanting, their voices rising in a desperate, pleading chorus, asking for rain, asking for a good harvest, asking for protection from the invisible terrors of the night. The weight of their prayers was just as heavy as the gravity of the earth. The humans were completely dependent on them, clinging to their knees, begging for guidance. But the travelers were tired. They were so incredibly tired. They did not want to be kings of the dirt. They had only ever wanted to be sailors of the sky. As the human cities grew larger, pushing outward, swallowing the wild marshes and carving up the silent plains into noisy, ordered farmland, the earth simply became too small and too loud. The raw, buzzing energy of millions of short-lived mortals completely drowned out the slow, ancient energy of the stranded gods. There was no grand war between the creators and the created. There was no fiery battle where the gods were violently overthrown by humanity. It was something much sadder and much more natural. It was simply the quiet retreat of the old, making way for the terrifying energy of the young. The ancient travelers looked at the sprawling, noisy, smoking cities they had helped create, and they realized they no longer belonged there. The world they had stumbled upon, the silent, empty canvas, was gone forever. The earth now belonged to the humans. And so, slowly, they began to step backward. Imagine a tall, cloaked figure slipping out of the back of a grand temple in the middle of the night. They do not announce their departure. They simply walk away from the warmth of the fires and the smell of the roasting grain. With slow, heavy, deliberate steps, they leave the bustling river valleys behind. Where do you go when the world becomes too loud? You seek the places where humanity is still too afraid to build. They walked toward the heavy, rolling fog of the Zagros Mountains. As they climbed higher, leaving the flat plains below, the chaotic noise of the human settlements began to fade. The barking dogs and the crying children became nothing more than a faint, distant hum, eventually swallowed entirely by the wind. Up here, the air was cooler. The thick, stinging wood smoke was replaced by the clean, sharp scent of damp earth and crushed pine needles. They moved deeper into the shadows, disappearing into the vast, untouched cedar forests of Lebanon. These forests were dark, ancient, and deeply quiet. The massive trees, with trunks as thick as a house, stood like silent sentinels, blocking out the harsh light of the sun and swallowing any sound that dared to enter. Imagine sitting down at the base of one of these giant, moss-covered trees. The ground is soft, piled high with centuries of fallen, rotting needles. You lean your heavy, tired head back against the rough bark. You close your eyes. Finally, there is silence. It is not the absolute, frozen silence of the stars, but it is a deep, earthly quiet. You can hear the slow, comforting drip of morning dew falling from the branches. You can hear the soft rustle of a small animal moving through the ferns. You are no longer surrounded by the frantic, burning urgency of humanity. You are completely enveloped in the slow, patient, unhurried breathing of the deep wild. The humans, waking up to find their temples empty, did not understand. In their desperate need for comfort, they looked up at the sky and told each other stories. They whispered that the gods had finally grown their wings again and returned to the glittering stars above. They pointed to the constellations and named them after the lords who had vanished. But the travelers had not gone up. They had simply stepped into the shadows. They became the recluses of the ancient world. They were the mysterious figures moving just beyond the edge of the firelight. They were the deep, echoing voices in the hidden caves, the watchers in the misty valleys, the silent ghosts of the cedar forests. They traded their heavy crowns for the quiet anonymity of the wilderness. The velvet cage of the earth had not just trapped them, it had eventually pushed them to the very edges of the world. They were prisoners in their own sanctuary, forced to hide in the deep, dark corners of the planet, watching in silent, aching exhaustion as humanity inherited the earth, filling the beautiful, empty silence with the roaring, triumphant noise of civilization. Even the deepest, darkest shadows of the ancient cedar forests could not keep the world at bay forever. For a time, the stranded travelers found a fragile peace beneath the massive, weeping branches of the ancient trees. But humanity is a creature of endless hunger. They do not just build, they consume. Imagine sitting in the cool, silent dampness of the forest floor, finally feeling your heavy heartbeat slow down. And then, riding on the gentle wind, comes a sound. It is incredibly faint at first, a tiny, sharp interruption in the quiet. Thwack. Pause. Thwack. It is the rhythmic, unforgiving sound of a bronze axe biting into solid wood. The humans were coming. They were marching into the sacred, untouched places, cutting down the giant sentinels to build their ships, to feed their massive, roaring fires, and to raise the roofs of their sprawling, noisy palaces. The earth was shrinking. The open plains belonged to the farmers. The river valleys belonged to the loud, smoking cities. And now, the deep forests were falling to the woodcutters. For the ancient travelers, heavy with the gravity of the planet and deeply exhausted by the chaotic energy of the new world, there was nowhere left to run on the surface. To find true, unbroken silence, they had to look downward. They had to willingly walk away from the sky they once ruled and step directly into the belly of the earth. Imagine a vast, sweeping landscape far from the muddy rivers of Mesopotamia. It is a barren, quiet place, where the wind howls over strange, towering chimneys of pale, yellow rock. This is not the hard, unforgiving granite of the deep mines. This is a soft, porous volcanic stone. It is hardened ash from the ancient fiery breath of the planet. To the touch, it feels almost like packed powder, dry and yielding beneath your fingertips. This soft earth offered them a final sanctuary. They did not dig to find glowing fuel or precious metals like the exhausted laborers of the past. They dug to create emptiness. They were carving out giant, hollow bubbles of silence beneath the crust of the screaming world. Imagine the slow, methodical process of hollowing out a mountain from the inside. They used simple, heavy tools to scrape away the soft, pale rock. Scrape, crumble, fall. The sound was not violent. It was a soft, rhythmic whispering as the dry stone surrendered, falling to the floor in heaps of pale dust. The air filled with the incredibly dry, chalky scent of ancient ash that had not seen the light of the sun for millions of years. With every foot they carved inward, they were creating a masterpiece of isolation. They built massive descending staircases that spiraled deeper and deeper into the total dark. They carved out grand, vaulted halls that mirrored the majestic temples of the surface. But here, there were no chanting crowds. There were no burning sacrifices. There was only the beautifully sculpted, echoing emptiness. Let us walk down into one of these hidden subterranean worlds. As you take your first step down the narrow, spiraling stone staircase, the blinding golden light of the afternoon sun is instantly left behind. The transition is not sudden. It is a slow, gentle fading. The bright daylight softens into a hazy, dusty twilight, and then, as you turn the corner of the stairs, it disappears completely. You are swallowed by a deep, absolute, and magnificent darkness. In this total blackness, the only way to see is to carry the fire with you. Imagine holding a heavy wooden torch wrapped in thick, coarse cloth and soaked in animal fat. When the spark catches, the flame bursts into life with a sudden, warm whoosh. The light is not clean or steady. It is a living, breathing thing. It flickers frantically, casting a low, deep orange glow that barely pushes the darkness back a few feet. The flame burns with a thick, heavy smoke that smells of roasting pitch and old wood. As you hold the torch high, the light catches the textured marks on the ceiling. You can see every single groove, every patient scrape where heavy hands had slowly carved the room out of the rock. The shadows created by the flickering fire do not stay still. They dance and stretch across the pale, dusty walls, making the cavern feel vast, alive, and incredibly private. As you walk deeper, leaving the surface world hundreds of feet above you, the atmosphere undergoes a profound change. The dry, burning heat of the desert sun is completely gone. Down here, the temperature never changes. Whether it is a blistering summer day or a freezing winter night on the surface, the air inside the deep earth remains exactly the same. It is a heavy, eternal chill. Feel that cool air wrap around your shoulders like a damp, heavy cloak. It sinks into your skin, settling deep into your thick, heavy bones. It is not the biting cold of a winter wind. It is a still, stagnant, ancient cold. It slows your blood. It makes your heavy eyelids feel incredibly tired. The earth down here is holding its breath, and it demands that you do the same. And then, there is the dampness. Even though the volcanic rock is dry, the earth is alive with hidden water. Deep underground, the heavy moisture of the planet slowly seeps through the millions of tiny pores in the stone. Run your hand along the wall of the cavern. It is no longer dry and powdery. It is slick, coated in a thin, invisible layer of cold, mineral-rich sweat. The air you breathe is incredibly heavy, thick with the scent of wet stone, old dust, and the deep, raw smell of the subterranean world. Listen to the absolute silence of this place. The barking dogs, the crying children, the chopping axes, none of those chaotic, frantic noises can penetrate hundreds of feet of solid rock. The silence here is thick and heavy. It presses against your ears like a physical weight. But it is not completely quiet. If you stand perfectly still and hold your breath, you will hear the true heartbeat of the deep earth. Drip. Somewhere in the vast, echoing darkness, a single drop of water gathers on the ceiling. It swells, heavy with the minerals of the rock, until it finally falls, hitting a small, dark pool below. Pause. The echo of that single drop travels through the empty, hollowed-out halls. It is a beautifully clear, musical sound that ripples through the heavy air and slowly fades away into the dark. Drip. For the ancient travelers who had retreated to these deep cities, this slow, echoing rhythm was a lullaby. They would sit in the grand, shadowy halls, wrapping their heavy cloaks tightly around their chilled shoulders, and simply listen to the water. They did not speak. They did not move. They just let the incredibly slow, patient rhythm of the deep earth wash over them, soothing the exhaustion of 1,000 loud, chaotic years. Was this massive underground complex a refuge, or was it a tomb? In truth, it was both. It was the ultimate, impenetrable inner chamber of their velvet cage. By burying themselves alive, they had finally found safety from the overwhelming, burning energy of humanity. But they had also entirely surrendered the sky. Down here, in the crushing, heavy dark, there were no stars to look at. There was no painful reminder of the home they had lost. There was only the rock, the cold, and the dripping water. They had traded the infinite, terrifying expanse of the universe for a perfectly carved, beautifully silent stone box. Imagine the final, definitive moment of their retreat. A heavy, perfectly round stone door, weighing massive tons, is rolled slowly across the entrance of the tunnel. Grind, scrape, thud. The heavy block of rock slots perfectly into place, completely sealing the passageway. The last sliver of natural light from the world above is snuffed out forever. The lock is turned from the inside. They have shut the door on the roaring, vibrant world of humanity, choosing instead to rest in the cool, damp embrace of the dirt. The earth had finally swallowed its magnificent travelers entirely, holding them safe, silent, and incredibly still in the deep, heavy dark, waiting patiently for them to simply close their eyes and sleep. While the ancient travelers slept in their perfectly carved, silent stone boxes deep beneath the earth, the surface of the world continued to turn. Centuries bled into millennia. The heavy, rolling dunes of the desert completely swallowed the last rusted fragments of the great silver ships. The deep, dark shafts of the mountain mines collapsed, filling with heavy rubble and forgotten dust. The world above had completely moved on, leaving the true history of the stars buried far below the roots of the ancient trees. But humanity has a deep, desperate need to remember. Even when the truth is gone, humans will reach their hands into the dark to pull out a story. Imagine walking away from the loud, smoking center of a sprawling Mesopotamian city, stepping softly towards the quiet, muddy banks of the Euphrates River. It is late at night. The chaotic noise of the daylight has faded into a gentle, rhythmic chorus of hidden crickets and the slow, heavy rushing of the dark water. The sky is clear, and a massive, glowing silver moon hangs low over the horizon, casting long, pale shadows across the reeds. In this quiet, silver light, a human sits alone by the edge of the water. He is not a king, and he is not a god. He is just a mortal, with tired eyes and calloused hands. Watch closely as he reaches down into the shallow water. He plunges his hands into the thick, dark mud of the riverbed. Feel the sudden, shocking cold of the wet earth wrapping around his fingers. He digs deep, scooping up a heavy handful of raw, unshaped clay. This clay is the very flesh of the planet. It is thick, heavy, and smells of ancient roots, crushed shells, and the raw, green life of the river. He pulls it out of the water, sitting cross-legged in the cool night air, and begins to work it between his palms. Listen to the soft, rhythmic sound of the wet mud being pressed and folded. Squelch. Pat. Fold. He kneads the cold earth, pushing out the tiny bubbles of air, smoothing away the hard little pebbles. He rolls it into a ball, and then, with careful, deliberate pressure, he flattens it into a small, thick rectangle, no larger than the palm of his hand. The clay is incredibly smooth now, glistening faintly in the moonlight. It is soft, yielding, and completely blank. It is a tiny, empty canvas made of dirt, waiting to hold the memories of the universe. Next to him on the grass lies a simple, fragile tool. It is not a glowing crystal, and it is not a machine forged from star metal. It is just a thin, hollow piece of river reed, snapped from a stalk, its end cut into a sharp, flat wedge. The human picks up the fragile piece of grass. He holds the heavy, wet block of clay in one hand, balancing its cold weight. He takes a slow, deep breath of the humid night air, closing his eyes for just a moment to gather his thoughts. He is trying to remember. He did not see the magnificent, towering beings step out of the sky. He did not hear the agonizing, metallic groans of the rusting ships. He did not feel the crushing, jealous gravity pulling the travelers down into the dirt. Those things happened long, long before his grandfather's grandfather was ever born. He only knows the faint, echoing whispers of the stories that have been passed down around the crackling fires. He opens his eyes, looks down at the smooth, wet earth, and presses the sharp edge of the reed into the clay. Press, pull, lift. The sound is incredibly small, just a tiny, soft whisper of the grass slicing into the damp mud. He turns the reed slightly, pressing it again. Press, pull, lift. With every slow, careful movement, he leaves behind a tiny, sharp shadow in the clay. These are not flowing, elegant lines. They are rigid, wedge-shaped marks. They look like the tiny footprints of birds walking across the soft mud after a rainstorm. This is how the majestic, heartbreaking history of the cosmos is finally reduced to dirt. Think about the profound, heavy irony of this moment. The great travelers had crossed the unimaginably vast, freezing, and silent oceans of deep space. They had commanded vessels of flawless, blinding metal. They had understood the complex, humming mathematics of the stars. And now, their entire existence, their epic struggle against the weight of the earth, is being translated into tiny scratches on a piece of wet mud made by a fragile piece of grass. As the human continues to press the reed into the clay, the truth of the past begins to quietly, beautifully warp. Human memory is a deeply flawed and imaginative thing. When humans cannot understand the slow, quiet tragedy of a rusting machine, they invent magic. As the scribe carves the tiny wedges in the moonlight, the rusted, dying ships of the Anunnaki are not described as broken vessels. Instead, they become chariots of fire that roared across the heavens. The slow, creeping biological changes caused by the thick atmosphere and the heavy gravity are forgotten. Instead, The travelers are described as immortal, towering gods who could command the fierce storms and throw bolts of lightning from their fingertips. The deep, agonizing retreat into the dark, silent underground cities is not recorded as a desperate surrender to exhaustion. Instead, it is written down as a grand, mythical descent into the underworld, a magical realm of spirits and shadows. The truth was too sad, too quiet, and too slow. It was a story of heavy bones, thick air, and terrible homesickness. But the humans needed something grander. They needed powerful deities to protect their crops and bring the rain. And so, with every gentle press of the wooden reed into the cold clay, the painful physical reality of the stranded travelers was gently erased, replaced by the sweeping dramatic poetry of myth. Watch the human's face in the silver light. His eyes are narrowed in deep concentration. He presses the final mark into the bottom corner of the tablet. The wet clay is now covered in tightly packed, neat rows of tiny, wedge-shaped shadows. The story is complete. But right now, the memory is still wet. It is soft. If he were to press his thumb across the surface, the story would smear and vanish back into smooth mud. To make the memory permanent, the earth must be baked. Imagine the passing of the night. The silver moon slowly sinks below the horizon, and the heavy, burning golden sun rises over the flat plains of Mesopotamia. The human takes the soft, wet tablet and places it carefully on a flat stone, directly beneath the blazing heat of the morning sky. Slowly, the intense heat of the sun begins to draw the moisture out of the clay. The water of the river evaporates, twisting up into the air and disappearing into the thick atmosphere. As the water leaves, the soft, dark mud begins to shrink. It turns pale, it becomes hard, rigid, and incredibly fragile. The fluid, living truth of the travelers has completely evaporated, just like the water. What is left behind is a dry, hardened piece of stone. The history has been permanently locked into a legend. Thousands of years later, these very same pieces of baked dirt will be pulled out of the desert sand by modern hands. We will look at these tiny, wedge-shaped marks in museums behind thick glass, and we will call them the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, the great myths of the ancient world. We will read the translations and marvel at the wild, magical stories of sky gods and underworld queens. We will completely miss the quiet, desperate truth hiding beneath the poetry. Imagine one final quiet scene. It is a cold evening in a small mud brick house on the edge of the ancient city. A fire is burning low in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing light across the rough walls. A mother sits on a woven rug, holding a small, sleeping child against her chest. In her hand, she gently holds one of these baked clay tablets. She traces her fingers softly over the tiny, sharp wedges, feeling the rough texture of the baked earth. She leans down, resting her cheek against the top of her child's head, and she begins to whisper. Her voice is incredibly soft, slow, and melodic. She is not reading a history book. She is telling a bedtime story. She whispers about the grand, towering kings who came from the sparkling stars, who built the rivers, and then vanished into the deep, dark mountains to sleep forever. Listen to the rhythm of her hushed voice. It rises and falls like the gentle breathing of the sleeping earth. The grand cosmic tragedy of the Anunnaki, their rusted ships, their aching bones, their heavy gravity-bound hearts, has finally completed its long journey. It has been filtered through the wet clay, baked by the sun, and transformed into a soft, comforting lullaby. The mighty travelers of the cosmos had not just been conquered by the gravity of the earth. They had been entirely consumed by human imagination, turning into beautiful, fading ghosts, existing only to help a tired human child drift safely and peacefully into the long, dark night. There is a beautiful, quiet inevitability to all things that exist within the bounds of time. Mountains slowly wear down into smooth hills. Roaring rivers eventually carve their way to the silent, waiting sea. And even the most majestic beings, the great architects who fell from the distant stars, must eventually come to an end. But their end was not written in the violent, dramatic language of human wars. There was no final, fiery battle for the heavens. There was no sudden catastrophe that wiped them from the face of the earth. Instead, the closing of their immense, tragic story was incredibly peaceful. It was simply a long, slow exhale. Imagine a vast, completely forgotten canyon, far beyond the edges of the known world. It is a place where the human foot has never stepped, and where the loud, frantic noise of civilization has never reached. The walls of this canyon are made of deeply carved, ancient red sandstone, smoothed perfectly by millions of years of gentle, howling wind. At the very bottom of this deep valley, the shadows are long, cool, and a deep, comforting shade of violet. In this quiet, hidden place, imagine a single, towering figure walking incredibly slowly. This is one of the last ancient travelers. Look closely at their massive, heavy form. They do not look like a radiant god of the sky anymore. The thousands of years spent trapped beneath the heavy blanket of the Earth's atmosphere have taken their final toll. Their skin, once smooth and ethereal, is now deeply lined, textured like the cracked, sun-baked clay of the desert floor. Their incredibly dense, heavy bones, packed with the iron and calcium of the planet, have finally become a burden too great to carry. With every slow, deliberate step, you can hear the profound exhaustion in their body. Shuffle? Pause. Shuffle. The woven sandals drag softly against the fine, red dust of the canyon floor. Their massive shoulders are slumped forward, completely surrendered to the jealous, pulling hands of the Earth's gravity. They are not looking for a way out. They are no longer searching the narrow strip of blue sky above the canyon for a sign of a lost home. The deep, aching homesickness that had tormented them for millennia has completely burned away, leaving behind only a profound, hollow need for rest. They walk toward the towering canyon wall. There, carved naturally by the ancient winds, is a deep, shadowy alcove. It is a perfect, shallow cave, untouched by the harsh, baking light of the afternoon sun. The air inside is incredibly cool, smelling faintly of dry stone and old, undisturbed dust. The ancient traveler steps slowly into the cool shade. They stop. They look out at the beautiful, silent valley one last time. And then, with a long, trembling sigh, they slowly lower themselves to the ground. Imagine the physical sensation of that moment. Think about a time when you have been so unbelievably tired that your legs simply refused to hold you up any longer. Think about the incredible, sweeping relief that washes over your muscles when you finally sit down. As the heavy traveler leans their broad back against the cool, solid stone of the cave wall, a deep shudder of absolute relief travels through their massive frame. The immense, crushing battle against gravity is finally over. They do not have to stand anymore. They do not have to fight the heavy, downward pull of the world. They let the earth take their entire weight, sinking comfortably into the soft, red sand covering the cave floor. They rest their heavy, calloused hands on their knees. They tilt their head back against the rock. and very, very slowly they close their ancient, tired eyes. Listen to the rhythm of their breathing. It is not labored or panicked. It is incredibly deep, slow, and peaceful. Inhale, pulling in the dry, quiet air of the canyon. Exhale, releasing the tension of 1,000 lifetimes. With every breath, the heavy burden of their existence is pushed out into the wind. Deep inside their massive chest, their powerful, earth-bound heart begins its final, beautiful winding down. For thousands of years it had beaten like a heavy drum, thump, 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 forcing the thick, iron-rich blood through their heavy limbs. But now, without the need to move, without the need to fight, the heart realizes that its incredibly long shift is over. The spaces between the beats begin to stretch. Thump. A long, quiet pause. Thump. It is matching the slow, geological pulse of the canyon itself. The traveler's body temperature begins to gently drop, slowly matching the cool, unchanging chill of the shadowed stone. The pain in their heavy joints fades into a soft, numb warmth. The edges of their consciousness begin to blur and soften, like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. They do not experience fear. Fear belongs to creatures who still have something to protect. When you have already lost the stars, and when you have completely surrendered the earth, there is nothing left to fear. There is only the sweet, welcoming embrace of the long sleep. They take one final, incredibly shallow breath. The air slips out from between their lips with a sound like a gentle breeze rustling through dry leaves. Shh. And then there is absolute stillness. The heart completely stops. The heavy chest settles. The traveler has fallen into a sleep so deep, so profound, that they will never wake up. But the earth is not finished with them. The velvet cage does not just hold the living. It claims the dead. Over the passing of countless unrecorded centuries, the silent traveler remains, sitting in the hidden alcove. The elements of the canyon go to work, but they are not violent. They are incredibly gentle. The dry, howling winds blow through the valley, picking up the microscopic, abrasive grains of red sand. Swish, swish. The soft, invisible sandpaper of the wind brushes against the traveler's resting form. Slowly, the biological matter begins to break down. But it does not rot. It simply dissolves. The immense, dense bones that had been forged by the Earth's heavy gravity begin to turn brittle. The minerals that the traveler had absorbed from the ancient wheat and the muddy rivers, the calcium, the iron, the salts, are slowly, patiently reclaimed by the planet. Imagine watching this transformation unfold in time-lapse over 10,000 years. The towering physical form of the god begins to softly crumble, flaking away like dry ash. The wind catches the tiny particles, lifting them into the air and carrying them out into the vast, open desert. The iron in their blood rusts and blends perfectly with the red sandstone. The heavy calcium of their bones breaks down into a fine, white powder, mixing with the dust of the cave floor. They are literally becoming the landscape. The universe is a closed circle. It is a beautiful, endless cycle of borrowing and returning. The ancient travelers had come from the deep, sparkling void of space, carrying the stardust of distant galaxies in their veins. But when they fell into the heavy, grasping gravity of the earth, they had to borrow the elements of the dirt to survive. Now, at the very end of their journey, they are paying their deep, ancient debt. The earth had fed them, and now they were feeding the earth. Eventually, if a human explorer were to somehow find that hidden canyon and stumble into that deep, shadowed alcove, they would not find the skeleton of a towering alien king. They would find nothing at all. They might see a slightly unusual, shimmering pile of red and white dust gathered in the corner, gently shifting in the breeze. They would have no idea that they were looking at the final, peaceful remains of a being who had once navigated the cosmic oceans. The velvet cage had performed its final magic. It had taken the magnificent, ethereal children of the stars, held them tightly until they grew unbearably tired, and then softly, quietly ground them down into the very dirt beneath our feet. The travelers never left the earth. They became the earth. They are the dust that swirls in the desert wind. They are the heavy clay that sits at the bottom of the rushing rivers. They are the iron that sleeps deep inside the mountains. And as the sun sets over the canyon, painting the sky in deep, bruised colors of purple and gold, the absolute silence of the valley is profound. It is the silence of a story that has been perfectly, beautifully finished. Conclusion. And so we return to the quiet, endless expanse of the night sky above you. Look up into the dark, beyond the heavy, comforting blanket of your own room. The stars are still there. They flicker like distant, ancient eyes, just as they did thousands of years ago when the grand, silver ships first drifted down onto the Mesopotamian sand. For the Anunnaki, this beautiful breathing world became a velvet cage, a soft, invisible prison of heavy gravity, thick air, and eventual profound exhaustion. They could not leave, and so they simply closed their eyes, letting the earth hold them in a gentle, eternal embrace. But for you tonight, this heavy gravity is not a prison. It is a deeply comforting blanket. Take a very slow, deep breath in. Feel the thick, invisible air filling your lungs. As you exhale, let go of all the frantic, loud energy of the human world. Let go of the bright lights, the endless noise, and the heavy burdens of your day. Feel the gentle, invisible hands of the earth pulling you down into the softness of your bed. You do not have to fight the gravity. You do not have to hold yourself up anymore. Just like the ancient travelers seeking the cool shade of the stone, you are allowed to completely surrender. Let your heavy muscles melt into the mattress. Let your tired bones rest. The earth is holding you softly, safely, and securely. There is nowhere left to go tonight. There is nothing left to build and nothing left to carry. Close your eyes. Listen to the slow, steady rhythm of your own heartbeat, matching the deep, silent pulse of the planet beneath you. Drift softly into the long, silent dark, and let the ancient, whispering winds carry you away into a deep, peaceful, and unbroken sleep. Good night. Let us drift even deeper into the silent dark. If you are still awake, listening to the gentle whispers of the night, allow yourself to sink further down into the heavy, comforting mattress. The story of the ancient travelers has ended, but the slow, magnificent breathing of the earth never truly stops. We have watched the beings of the sky dissolve into the red dust of the canyon. Now, let us leave the narrow shadows of that hidden cave and float outward, drifting like a weightless spirit over the vast, sleeping landscape of the ancient world. Think of this as the deep dream of the planet, a quiet, sprawling epilogue written entirely in dirt, water, and wind. Imagine floating high above the Mesopotamian valley in the absolute dead of night. There are no human fires down below anymore. The sprawling, noisy cities of mud and brick that once kept the ancient gods awake have been entirely abandoned by time. The chaotic, vibrant energy of those early humans burned brightly, and then, like all fires, it eventually moved on, seeking new forests to consume. What was left behind in the cradle of civilization was a profound, echoing emptiness. Look down at the grand, towering ziggurats. Once, these were massive, artificial mountains, proud staircases desperately reaching toward the unreachable stars. But they were not built of indestructible, alien star metal. They were built of the earth itself, baked mud, chopped reeds, and heavy clay, and the earth, with its infinite, quiet patience, always calls its pieces back home. Listen to the incredibly soft sound of a winter rain falling over the deserted plains. Pitter, patter, shh. It is not a violent, crashing storm. It is a slow, steady, weeping rain that falls for days on end. The heavy drops of water strike the hard, baked surfaces of the ancient temples. Water is the softest thing in the world, yet it is the master of stone and clay. Imagine the physical sensation of a hard mud brick getting wet. At first, it resists. But as the rain continues to fall, the dry, baked earth begins to drink the moisture. The water seeps into the microscopic cracks, finding the ancient, brittle pieces of river reed binding the brick together. Slowly, the hard edges of the stone begin to soften. You can hear it if you listen closely to the quiet dark. A soft, wet, sloughing sound. A heavy chunk of the ziggurat's high wall simply loses its strength, turning back into thick, heavy mud, and slides slowly down the side of the monument. It hits the ground with a thick, muted thud, splashing gently into the puddles below. This is how the earth erases history. Not with fire, but with water and gravity. Over hundreds and thousands of wet, silent winters, the grand temples melted. The sharp, towering corners became smooth, rounded mounds. The majestic staircases where the travelers once stood, desperately casting their minds out into the cosmos, turned into slippery, formless hills of wet dirt. The earth was gently taking back the clay it had loaned to the builders, flattening the landscape, pulling the artificial mountains back down to the sleeping floor of the valley. And then, there is the wind. When the long rains stop and the blistering summer sun bakes the melted mud dry again, the desert wind arrives to finish the slow, quiet burial. The wind carries millions of tiny golden grains of sand from the deep dunes, sweeping them across the flat plains. Swish, whisper, swish. The sand brushes against the melted mounds of the ancient cities. It catches in the hollows, it fills the collapsed doorways, and it piles up against the forgotten walls. Inch by inch, century by silent century, the golden blanket of the desert is pulled up over the ruins. Eventually, if you were to walk across this silent landscape, you would not see a destroyed city. You would only see a tell, a perfectly natural-looking, gentle hill rising softly out of the flat desert. You could climb to the top of this hill, lie down in the cool evening sand, and look up at the stars, completely unaware that you are resting on top of a buried palace, sleeping directly above the faded footprints of the gods. The velvet cage does not just trap its prisoners, it beautifully, perfectly hides them away in the dark. Now, shift your heavy, dreamlike gaze away from the buried cities and look towards the great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. We often think of rivers as permanent lines drawn on a map, but in the deep, slow rhythm of geological time, rivers are incredibly restless. They are like massive, heavy serpents, constantly, slowly writhing in their sleep. Imagine the deep, dark water of the Euphrates pushing against its muddy banks. Rush, swirl, pull. The heavy current is always chewing on the dirt, biting away small pieces of the earth on one side and depositing soft, new silt on the other. Over thousands of years, the river completely changes its path. It slowly uncoils, moving miles away from where it originally flowed. When the ancient travelers first arrived, they built their docks and stepped out of their rusting ships right onto the water's edge. But as time marched softly on, the river abandoned those ancient shores. It drifted away in the night, leaving the old, sacred riverbanks to dry up and turn to dust. The earth was literally shifting beneath their buried feet, scrambling the map, ensuring that the original landing sites of the cosmos would be forever lost in the winding, moving maze of the desert dirt. The water washed away the heavy footprints. The mud swallowed the dropped tools of the Igigi. The slow, sweeping movement of the planet's surface acted as a giant, soft broom, wiping the slate completely clean. Let us sink one last time into the absolute, crushing dark of the underground. Down below the melted ziggurats, down below the shifting, heavy rivers, down in the deep soil where the sunlight has never, ever reached. Here, in the cool, damp earth, there is no sound at all. There is only the incredibly slow, blind movement of life. Imagine the thick, woody root of a desert tamarisk tree. It is a tough, ancient plant, surviving in the harsh world above by sending its roots impossibly deep into the dark. The root pushes blindly through the packed dirt. Creep, push, stretch. It is searching for the deep, hidden moisture of the water table. As the root forces its way through the heavy black soil, its pale, sensitive tip bumps into something hard. It is not a rock. It is incredibly smooth, and it feels freezing cold to the touch. It is a tiny, forgotten fragment of star metal, a shattered piece of a magnificent engine that once hummed with the energy of a distant galaxy. It has been buried here in the silent dark for 10,000 years. Does the root pause? Does it recognize the impossible, alien miracle it has just touched? No. The earth doesn't care about the stars. The earth only cares about the quiet, relentless continuation of its own slow life. The thick, woody root simply bends. It wraps its rough, damp fibers tightly around the piece of cold metal, holding it in a firm, blind embrace, and continues pushing deeper into the dark. The fragment of the spaceship is now just a pebble to the tree. It has been entirely assimilated. It is just another piece of the heavy, silent ground, providing an anchor for a desert shrub. The grand cosmic tragedy has been reduced to fertilizer and deep soil. This is the ultimate, incredibly peaceful victory of the velvet cage. The earth did not just keep the Anunnaki from leaving, it absorbed their memory so completely that they became indistinguishable from the natural world. They are the melted mud of the hills. They are the dust blowing across the shifting rivers. They are the cold anchors held tightly by the roots in the dark. There is a profound, heavy comfort in this realization. Nothing is ever truly lost. It is simply folded back into the quiet, sleeping body of the world. As you lie there in the dark, let this realization wash over you like a heavy, warm blanket. You, too, are a part of this incredibly ancient, patient world. Whatever worries you carry, whatever loud, frantic noises are echoing in your mind from the daylight, they are all so incredibly small compared to the deep, silent rhythms of the earth. Feel the gravity holding you. It is not pulling you down, it is holding you safe. It is anchoring you to a planet that has endured for billions of years, a planet that has quietly swallowed falling stars, rusting ships, and towering gods, folding them all into a peaceful, unbroken sleep. You do not need to hold on to your thoughts tonight. Let them dissolve, just like the mud bricks of the ancient temples melting in the soft winter rain. Let your mind become a flat, quiet desert, smoothed entirely by the gentle, sweeping wind of your own slow breathing. Inhale, pulling in the quiet, undisturbed peace of the deep earth. Exhale, letting go of the world above. There is nowhere else you need to be. There is nothing left to remember. You are deeply buried in the comfort of the night, entirely safe in the heavy velvet embrace of the dark. Let the roots of sleep wrap gently around you, holding you completely still as you drift beautifully, endlessly, into the quiet center of the sleeping world. As our journey through the shifting sands of time finally comes to a close, let us return one last time to the quiet, endless expanse of the night sky. Look up, in your mind's eye, at the glittering canopy of stars. They still flicker with the same cold, distant light as they did thousands of years ago when those magnificent silver ships first drifted softly down to the earth. But tonight, those stars are not a destination. They are simply a beautiful, silent memory hanging above a sleeping world. The grand travelers of the cosmos did not lose a violent war, nor were they defeated by a sudden storm. They were simply embraced. They were gently, inevitably gathered into the arms of the planet. The heavy gravity anchored their bones, the thick, humid air filled their chests, and the slow, sweeping passage of time wove them directly into the dust and the clay of our history. The earth was never a prison of iron bars. It was a velvet cage, a soft, welcoming sanctuary that whispered, "Stay and rest." Now it is your turn to rest. Let the heavy, comforting gravity of the earth pull you down deep into your bed. Feel the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing, matching the ancient, quiet pulse of the sleeping planet beneath you. Release the weight of your day into the dark, just as the rusted ships surrendered to the golden dunes. There is nowhere left to go, and nothing left to carry. Let the cool, whispering winds of the desert wash over your tired mind, carrying you softly and safely into a deep, peaceful, and unbroken sleep. Good night.